The world from a bird's eye view. Clouds floating slowly, a continent where you can see many small countries, islands, and a calm sea that washes all parts of our land. If we get a little closer to the earth, we can see it in more detail, namely the beautiful country of China and the small province of Gansu, which is located in the northwest. This province, although small, is very prolific. It has a very rich agriculture, many mineral resources, and one huge advantage: the famous Silk Road passes through it. The sun is shining brightly, illuminating the palace of the Iron Banner League. Once upon a time, the Iron Knights fought fierce wars with the Gurian Bridge over who would dominate this small province of Gansu. Future warriors of the Iron Banner League train under the supervision of their superior, honing their hand-to-hand combat skills to perfection. They practice the same blow many times in order to master this technique masterfully. Their chief commander, Hyukoden Ziohyangju no Kondo, folding his arms across his chest and looking intently at his charges, claims that hand-to-hand combat is the basis of all fighting skills, regardless of what weapon they use. Young warrior Mangek practices his strike and remembers the commander's words that a weapon is just a tool, and a well-trained body can pierce the enemy and deal crushing blows to him. Another warrior named Banhyo is training his invincible technique. His stance is like a stone, his arms are strong, sweat is running down his face, his gaze is purposefully directed forward, and the words of the commander are spinning in his head that if you don't want to die, know how to survive. The commander, placing his hands on his belt, announced a short break. At that very moment, the warriors, who just a second ago seemed invincible, fell to the ground from fatigue. They only have a few minutes to catch their breath and continue training. Banhyo raised his hand to ask Commander Hyangjanim one question. All the warriors looked at him, waiting for what he wanted to ask. The commander also drew attention to him and allowed him to ask a question. Banhyo did not understand why he should train so hard if, when meeting with Master Murim, hand-to-hand combat would be useless and they could die, since he throws knives flawlessly and shoots clearly at the target. Everyone froze, waiting for an answer from the commander. He looked at them, frowned and said that low-ranking samurai like them had no chance of surviving a one-on-one battle with Master Murim. But the commander added that famous masters have one big weakness that newcomers like them do not have. All the aspiring warriors held their breath, and Banhyo dared to ask what Commander Hyangjanim meant. The commander smiled and said that such masters have one weakness: fame. All the soldiers the commander addressed were confused and did not understand what he wanted to say. Banhyo did not understand Hyangjanim the most, because he thought that this was the most obvious thing, that the famous master would be known to everyone, since he is one of the best masters in his field. Commander Hyangjanim told his wards that if the master they might meet is very famous, then they will know what kind of martial arts their opponent is strong in and what weapons he uses. And closing his eyes and folding his hands on his chest, the commander calmly continued to tell his future warriors that if they know the weaknesses of their enemy, then he will not know yours. This is how you can defeat the famous master. Opening his eyes, Commander Hyangjanim looked intently at his charges and said that this was the only way to win. And then he added that after lunch he would have time to study the masters of Guriungyo. All the novice warriors sat motionless and listened carefully to what their mentor was saying, but when the commander said his last phrase, everyone was very surprised that their experienced commander did not know something yet. One of the recruits exclaimed that their commander, despite his age, was still studying something all the time. From the mention of the commander's age, young Mangek laughed, covering his mouth with his hands. Banhyo saw that Mangek laughed. He was offended by the young man's mocking tone towards the commander. This angered Banhyo. He swung at the recruit and tried to figure out what was so funny about it. The bazaar is in the very center of the city. There are a lot of shops here, and there are always a lot of townspeople who want to buy something. They even come here with carts, because you simply cannot carry all the goods bought here in your hands. Both ordinary citizens and valiant warriors come to it to buy the best weapons for themselves. Walking through the bazaar, the young warrior saw a beautiful sword on one of the counters. His blade was long and sharp, the handle was blue, and a gorgeous red stone sparkled on it. Mangek froze in surprise in front of this amazing sword. He couldn't take his eyes off him. Noticing this, the seller began to praise this sword and say that the young man had a diamond in his eyes, since he noticed such an excellent sword. The seller said that this was a legendary sword from the west, that it had been stuck into a rock for a long time, and there was a legend about it that the one who pulled it out would certainly become a king. The seller continued to say that the strongest warriors of this country constantly fought with each other for the right to pull the sword out of the rock. They fought day and night, under the hot sun and even in the pouring rain. But by the irony of fate, it was a boy who was able to pull the sword out of the rock, who actually over time was able to unite the country and then became its ruler. Mangek was delighted and could not believe his ears that this was indeed a true story. His eyes lit up and he asked the seller if it was true. The seller, with a kind smile, waved his hands and said that this story is the most truthful of all, and that with this sword you can really become a king. The young man really wanted to get this sword, and he asked how much it cost. The seller turned away for a second, frowned and thought to himself that if the king came out onto the battlefield with such a trinket, he would immediately become food for crows. But at that very moment a stranger called out to him. The seller and the young man looked at the stranger. On his back he had a sack of food, a round straw hat hanging, and in his belt he had a powerful sword. The seller tensed when he saw what kind of sword the stranger was walking around with. The seller's face turned red, his veins stood out, and he asked the stranger how he would explain that he was carrying with him such a blade that could kill not only a pig, but also a person. The stranger, without a moment's hesitation, put his hand on his belt and calmly answered the seller that if you cut bones and flesh, you still kill, be it a pig or a person. The seller was very angry with these words. He grabbed a sword and was ready to fight with the stranger, claiming that he wanted to destroy his business. And the young man, realizing that there was going to be a fight, turned away and wanted to leave. The stranger just grinned and began to tease the seller, saying that he wanted to intimidate him with simple trinkets, and continuing to tease him, claimed that the value of the goods would decrease if a few scratches appeared on it. The seller was furious at the stranger's impudence. In a fit of rage, he swung his sword, jumped as high as he could, and shouted as he jumped that his goods were not a trinket. At that very second, the calm and cool young man put out his blade in one motion, and the seller hit it with his legendary sword and ended up on the ground behind the stranger. The seller was defeated. In a moment, the sword that could make its owner a king was easily defeated. His blade was cut into two parts, and the most precious stone fell out of the hilt. There was nothing superfluous in the young man's movements. He stood motionless, like a great warrior, only his hand moved, which returned the blade to its place. While the seller knelt on the ground and mourned his precious sword, the stranger turned to Mangek and asked him where the iron banner was. The young warrior was shocked by what he saw. He looked at the stranger in surprise and said that if he walked straight along the main road, he would see a large door. For a second Mangek froze, looking in the wake of the one who had just effortlessly left the seller at the broken trough. He was curious why the stranger needed to go to the Iron Banner League, and he asked him if anything had happened there. But this mysterious man, without turning around, only said that it was a good day for him today, and continued to confidently walk straight, slowly merging with other visitors to the bazaar. Mangek was delighted by this stranger. He thought it was very cool to be as incredible a person as the traveler who asked the way to the Iron Banner League. The sun illuminates a blue sky with small clouds, trees and a small house. The windows and door are open. There are several boxes in the yard, clothes are laid out on the bushes, and there is a hole in the fence wall, possibly from some kind of blow. Manhwa stood in the middle of the room near the table at which an old man sat and read something. Near one wall there was a rack with weapons, next to it there were two bags with things, and near the other wall there was a table on which stood a box, vases and all sorts of small utensils. Manhwa asked the elder what he was reading, to which the elder replied, turning the page, that he was reading The Art of War. He reads this book very carefully, although this is not the first time he rereads it. Manhwa sat down at the table with the elder, crossed his legs, leaned one hand on the table and asked him if he had quarreled with his grandson. But he didn't even have to wait for an answer, since everything was already clear from the old man's face. Putting down the book, the elder said that Sun Tzu's law not only concerns fighting, but it also contains wisdom for living on. Leaning even more heavily on the table, the warrior asked the elder to lend him his sword, arguing that he did not know when someone would want to poke a knife into his back, and he did not want to wait for that moment. The elder raised his eyes, looked sternly at the young man and asked what kind of sword he needed, the one that takes life or, on the contrary, saves this life. It was clear that Manhwa was very excited. He wanted to get any sword as quickly as possible, preferably small in size but the best from the elder's entire arsenal. The territory of the Iron Banner League, illuminated by the bright sun, is very huge. There are many pavilions and sites where future warriors train tirelessly to become the best masters of their craft. They were in the Three Knights Pavilion. The employee, filling out the papers, asked the newcomer questions and, surprised that he did not know the answer to them, raised his eyes to him and his hand with the pen froze over the parchment. He was very surprised that the stranger did not know what family he was from. He stood in front of the employee and answered questions briefly, laconically, and without hiding anything. He said that he doesn't know what family he comes from because he is an illegitimate child. The employee was amazed by this frank confession. He continued to ask the newcomer the standard paperwork questions. Raising his hand to his beard, the employee asked what school he had previously attended. Also calmly and laconically, the stranger from the bazaar answered the employee's question that he had never studied at any school before. Each subsequent answer from the stranger left the employee perplexed. Throwing up his hands, he did not understand how a person could not know his parents and how it was possible not to study anywhere. The stranger looked at him resolutely and could not object to anything because everything he said was true. The employee became a little depressed and put his hand on his face and sank into himself. He thought about where such an eccentric fell on his head. Then two warriors from the league entered the room. The advisor stood up and joyfully exclaimed how good it was that the two of them came here. The stranger looked back to see who had entered the room. It was Anso and Dan Zhu from the Black Banner. Anso had scars on his face from many battles and Dan Zhu commanded and trained the recruits. The advisor approached the warriors from the league and said that they once said that the Black Banner party needed replenishment. Pointing out the stranger, the advisor said that this guy came on the recommendation of General Hensiop from Chonghabib. Looking at the unfamiliar guy, the commander of the recruits, Dan Zhu, asked the guy his name to find out more information about the newcomer. The boy looked straight into the commander's eyes and answered, as always calmly and clearly, that his name was Dedu. The advisor and two league warriors looked intently at Dedu. The commander asked what the newcomer's last name was, to which the guy replied that his last name was Do. While the commander of the recruits was asking his new acquaintance for his last name, Anso at that time looked closely at Do to get to know him better and noticed something unusual. Anso having discovered this, he became very tense and frowned. A shadow ran across his face and distrust of Do was visible in his eyes. Looking unfriendly at his new acquaintance, Anso blurted out that he was left-handed. Dan Zhu looked at his comrade, surprised that he was paying attention to such little things. Confident in himself and his strength, Du took the hilt of his sword with his left hand and half pulled it out of its sheath, showing the warriors exactly how and with which hand he holds his sword. Still in disbelief, but in a calmer tone, Anso asked Du why he held his sword this way. Closing his eyes, Du put his sword back into its sheath in one movement and, answering the question, said that it was just convenient for him. He opened his eyes and looked straight at Anso. The experienced warrior peered intently at his new acquaintance, who still did not inspire confidence in him. The house in which Manhwa continues to conduct his dialogue with the elder. Manhwa told the old man that in the morning he saw one of the warriors go out to the Goblin Mountain and train hard, and that he would soon fight with him. While they were having their conversation, strands of black hair fell to the floor one after another. Manhwa asked Elder B if his team would be able to participate in the duel. The elder unrolled his leather roll for small knives and began to arrange them in order. He looked at Manhwa sternly and said that his team would participate. At this very time, the warrior, having borrowed a small knife from the elder, cut the hair from his head on which a snake tattoo was visible. He said that his team doesn't even have a coach. A second later, 3 warriors entered the house. These were Anso, Dan Zhu and the new warrior of the league, Dedu. Recruit Commander Dan Zhu said that he wanted to introduce them to a new captain. Banhyo, who was still shaving his head and thereby exposing the snake tattoo even more, looked towards the trio. The elder also looked back and the two of them stared at the new team captain. The elder put aside his leather knife roll and began to peer intently at his new acquaintance. Banhyo froze looking at the newly made captain, and Dae-do calmly looked around. A tense silence hung in the room. At this very moment, when the tension between everyone present in this room reaches its peak, Ma runs into the house, joyful and happy, holding dumplings in his hands. Seeing that same stranger from Ma's bazaar, Mangek freezes in surprise, points his finger at him and couldn't even utter a word from shock. Everyone present in this room stared at the young man who froze in the doorway with dumplings in his hands and was unable to move from surprise. The sky was overcast with black thunderclouds. There was a strong wind and thousands of lightning flashes every second as if predicting some kind of disaster. The estate of the Iron Banner League rises majestically above the ground and stands motionless like a stone even in such bad weather. The League canteen is always very light and cozy, and all future warriors come here to eat delicious food and gain strength and energy for future training. There are pictures on the wall. All warriors are like one big family, but everyone behaves differently when they eat. Some people discuss their progress in training, while others want to quickly eat everything so they can go back to perfecting their punches. The food here is always varied and nutritious. Today's dinner included gyoza rice, stewed zucchini, and fried tofu. Banhyo took one piece of fried tofu with wooden chopsticks, looked at it and brought it to his mouth. Ma Mangek greedily gobbled up the rice on both cheeks. He loved food and was sure that the more you eat, the faster you can become strong. Banhyo sat staring ahead and slowly chewed his tofu. He was completely lost in thought. His whole body was tense and his eyes showed irritation and distrust. Ma Mangek was sitting directly opposite him. Seeing Banhyo's state now, he pointed his chopstick somewhere to the side and asked him who this person was. Banhyo pointed his chopsticks at Dae-do and said that this was their commander. Ma Mangek opened his eyes wide in surprise and even stopped eating his rice. At this time, Dae-do closed his eyes and slowly finished his portion. He always looked calm and reserved. It seemed that even while eating he never relaxed. Turning my head towards the new commander, Ma Mangek looked at him with curiosity. He asked Banhyo if everything was okay since it seemed to him that everything was fine. Banhyo stared at the new recruit. His eyebrows knitted and his gaze became gloomy. He stared intently at him for several seconds before saying something to him. He became darker than a cloud. The snake on his head looked as if it was ready to attack anyone at any moment. Banhyo said in a hostile manner that this is only the second time Mangek has been here, while he had already joined the Black Banner for the 8th time. He asked his interlocutor if he remembered their last commander. Ma Mangek reluctantly replied that he remembered. It was clear that Banhyo admired his past commander. He said that he was like Master Murim. The commander's eyes always showed self-confidence, he was so impeccable, and he always held his sword with both hands. Even in a hopeless situation, he was determined to win and was always the first to enter a fight, leading his team. Banhyo, he said that the previous commander was always a hero and died as a hero. Here Dead asked him what will happen if he also dies famous. Banhyo stuck his chopsticks into the rice, turned to the new commander and said that he was not a teammate, much less a hero. Banhyo, he said that he was Ronin and that he came here for profit. His words had no effect on Dae-do, who exhaled and continued eating his rice. Banhyo smiled, waved his hand and said that he would have an incentive to risk his life if his superiors gave him enough money. And he added ironically that they were low-ranking samurai. At that moment, the elder sat down opposite Banhyo and menacingly told him to silently eat his rice. Ma Mangek, who until that moment had been distracted from his meal, immediately began to quickly absorb his portion. The elder, holding his plate in one hand and pointing his chopsticks at Banhyo, told him that he was now dictating his own rules on how to live and how to eat. Banhyo, whom the elder had just shamed, began to quickly finish his portion, saying that he did not want to eat rice because today it tasted better than usual. While Bangyo frantically devoured his food, Ma Mangek looked at him in bewilderment and said that before he did not complain about the taste, but now he is dissatisfied with the fact that today the rice tastes better. Manhwa stopped and looked menacingly at the young warrior. He was unhappy that he did not understand anything. He said irritably that there is only one reason why the soldiers are fed tasty and satisfying. And this usually happens before a difficult battle, which they say will happen soon. When Manhwa said his last phrase, Commander Dae-do was already eating the last grain of rice, completely immersed in his thoughts. The storm clouds thickened more and hung over the estate of the Iron Banner League, as if foreshadowing that some kind of disaster might happen. After lunch, all the commanders-in-chief gathered in the council room. On the wall hung a stretched flag with the inscription unwavering as a reminder that in any situation one must always move forward without doubting anything. In the middle of the room there was a huge long table. At the head of the table sat Samunbiak, the head of the Iron Banner, and the detachment commanders sat on the sides. They all looked tense and were waiting for what the head would say. The head of the Iron Banner looked around at everyone. He didn't want to give bad news but knew it was inevitable. After hesitating for another second, he told everyone present in this room that the location of the Gurian Bridge had been revealed. After this message, all the commanders turned their gaze to the head. There was silence in the council room and no one dared to speak first. The news that the head told them in this room was a blow to everyone. Anso from the Black Banner crossed his arms over his chest, closed his eyes and plunged into thought, trying to come up with at least some plan. Sop-yong, the right hand of the head, abruptly stood up from his seat and in one movement took the scroll with the map and opened it. He pointed out exactly where the forward base of the Gurian Bridge was and said that it was located in Nohosen. One of the commanders, looking at this map, put his hand to his chin and said that it was a day's drive to Nohosen. Another commander bared his teeth, angry at the enemies, saying that they were non-humans who were not afraid to enter the threshold of their Iron Banner. The third commander clenched his hand into a fist and said impatiently that since they know where the enemy is, they should not hesitate and strike first. The leader said with restraint that after 2 days of patrolling, each commander would be ordered to immediately prepare for a general attack. Everyone present in this room fell silent and looked at each other in alarm, waiting for what else the head would say. The head turned to Anso and told him not to leave. Anso looked questioningly at the head. Turning to Anso, the head asked him if he could immediately gather all his people as a reserve detachment. Mrs. Hobi Up looked closely at the head and asked him whether it was possible to make such a decision without the consent of the squad leader. Samunbiak, the head of the Iron Banner, tensed for a second and clenched his teeth at this question. Then he leaned on the back of his throne and said that he understood very well what Mrs. Hobi Up wanted to express with this question. Samunbiak looked around at everyone present and said that it would be possible to follow the wise decision of the head of Mengju. Sop-young interrupted him and said that the head of Mengju ordered him not to interfere, even though he explained the whole situation. To which Samunbiak irritably said that in this way the head of Mengju showed his disrespect. After these words, Mrs. Hobi Up suddenly remembered something. She opened her eyes wide and looked a little worried. A moment later, she sharply squeezed the hem of her dress in her hand, bit her lips and lowered her eyes down, thinking about something of her own. The weather was wonderful outside. The gazebo stood in the very center of the garden. There were many beautiful scarlet roses growing in this garden. The man's hand took the bud of one of the many roses that grew in this garden, her tenderly for a long time without taking his eyes off. Then he brought the flower to his face and closed his eyes and with a smile began to inhale the exquisite aroma of the rose. He opened his eyes and immediately his face changed. He was already looking at the red petals with some hostility. With one movement of his thumb, the man, as if cutting with a sharp blade, cut the bud from the stem. And the flower fell to the ground, leaving behind red petals in the air as if they were droplets of blood. Holding in his hand the stem on which a second ago there had been a beautiful bud, the man looked at him and smiled. The man was squatting and at that second someone called him and he dropped the stem from his hands. He closed his eyes, exhaled and smiled, knowing from the voice who called him. It was his sister Mrs. Hobi Up. She quickly entered the garden and looked menacingly at her brother and asked him why he wasn't going to the general meeting. She was already close to her brother when he began to get up and, without turning to her, asked if she could do anything without him. Lady Hobi Up looked at him intently and said in a dissatisfied tone that the head of the Iron Knights would not say such words. Slowly turning his head and looking straight into his sister's eyes, he said with a smile that he became the head not of his own free will. Mrs. Hobi Up looked at her brother with disappointment and thought that he was very irresponsible. He turned fully to his sister with his arms outstretched and said that the only reason he was appointed leader was because he was the last son in their family. Then he became gloomy and pointed his finger at his sister and told her that if she, too, were a man, she would become the head of the Iron Knights. Mrs. Hobi Up was very surprised by her brother's words and thought that there was some truth in his words. He continued to say that he was now sitting in an unwanted commander's chair only because he was born a man. And she was born a girl, so she can't get married until I turn 30. And on top of that, she still has to take care of him. After her brother's words, the lady closed her eyes to accept the bitter truth. The two of them were already leaving the garden when someone again called out to the commander. 3 girls ran towards their brother and sister and shouted that they had been looking for their master for a very long time. Hobi Up's brother looked at these girls in awe and a gentle smile appeared on his face. The girls began to cheerfully tell him something, and he, spreading his arms as if embracing them, began to take them away with him. While the lady watched this picture, she closed her eyes, clenched her hands into fists and clenched her teeth. It felt like she wanted to forget what she saw, and jumped into the river upside down. She sank deeper and deeper into the water without even resisting it. Closing her eyes, she slowly sank to the bottom. The air in her lungs was already starting to run out, and when she finally ran out of air, she decided to swim to the surface. When she emerged from the water, a little out of breath, she began to greedily swallow air and swim to the shore. When she came out of the river, she immediately fell to the ground, exhausted. She tried to catch her breath and come to her senses, when I immediately heard very strange sounds on the other side of the river and turned my attention to it. She became very interested in what was happening there and decided to go have a look. Having reached the place where the strange sounds were coming from, Mrs. Hobi Up, all wet after bathing, froze at what she saw. She looked at it without taking her eyes off. How the newly appointed commander Do masterfully controlled the sword. He trained without noticing that he was being watched. Jumping as high as possible, he turned around himself in space, practicing some kind of technique. And when he finished it, like a stone, he stood in the last finishing position holding his sword on his outstretched left hand. Do took a deep breath and remained in this position for a few more seconds. His gaze was resolutely directed forward. And then in one movement he straightened up and, without looking, sheathed his blade. His entire muscular back was covered in scars. The sun broke through the green foliage of the tree. Its trunk was curved. Do continued to train and practice his punches over and over again. Mrs. Hobi Up froze in amazement when she saw a man she didn't know honing his fighting skills. She looked at him without taking her eyes off, amazed at the filigree movements of this man. Forgetting that a couple of minutes ago she was walking to the bottom of the river and that all her clothes were thoroughly wet, she held onto a tree with one hand and peered in surprise at this stranger. After a couple of minutes of close observation, she decided to approach and speak to him. When she approached him, Do made a large lunge forward holding his sword in his left hand and cut the air in front of him. Approaching him at a safe distance so that he would not accidentally hit her, Mrs. Hobi Up asked him if he was from the Iron Banner. Ignoring her, Do made another lunge and again swung his blade as if cutting someone into 2 parts. The lady was very surprised by the filigree of his movements and, with her mouth slightly open, she continued to watch him. Do put forward his sword, the handle of which resembled a dragon's head. And the blade itself was small and slightly curved. When the warrior finished one of his techniques, Mrs. Hobi Up said that he had a very amazing sword. After these words, he finally noticed her, turned and looked at her for several seconds. Then, stroking the blade of his sword, Do said that this was his only friend. Lady Hobi Up curiously asked what name the warrior gave him. In one movement, Do sheathed his blade and said that he had no name and that it was enough for him to call the sword his friend. At that very moment, Mrs. Hobi Up began to tremble violently from the cold. She completely forgot that all her clothes were completely wet, and remembering this made her shiver even more. Having finished his training, Do went to his cape which was hanging on a tree branch and took it. He turned to the lady with the cape in his hands and saw that she was shaking and very cold. Mrs. Hobi Up had a toothache. While after finishing the training, Day was burning with heat. He looked at his new acquaintance, who was becoming colder and colder with every second. Day, with his eyes closed, took his cape with both hands and pulled it forward. For 1 second it seemed to the lady that this beautiful warrior would now lend her his cape, which she would be very happy about now. But Dedu was not going to give his cape to the stranger. So he put it on himself, inserting his hands one by one. The lady was extremely surprised that this man did not pay any attention to the fact that all her clothes were wet and did not try to warm her up. Dedu, straightening his cape, silently walked past the lady, which in turn the lady was outraged. She turned to look after him and thought irritably, who is this man? The elder's house stands against the backdrop of a clear blue sky. Day after training went to the elder. When he entered the house he saw that someone was there. The elder and Banhyo were sitting at the table, and when he entered the house they turned around to look at him. Mangek approached him and said that, as they were told, a meeting of captains was now being held. Looking at the young man, Do asked what his name was, to which the young man replied that his name was Mangek. Do without saying a word turned around and headed towards the exit, and Mangek wished him a good journey. When the new captain left the house, Banhyo quipped that Do couldn't remember the names of the 9 members of their team. Mangek began to defend the new captain and said that even Banhyo does not call him by name and that every day he hears that he is called a recruit. Turning to the young man, Banhyo crossed his legs and propped his face with one hand and asked what he didn't like. Indignant Mangek, he said that naturally he doesn't like being called a recruit and not by his name. Having become a little gloomy, Banhyo wanted to slightly intimidate this young man by saying that once upon a time he often visited a woman in a brothel whose name was exactly the same as his. Having looked a little closer, he added that not only their names are similar, but even their faces. The recruit was confused and asked in surprise whether this was true, looking at his interlocutor. Banhyo abruptly stood up from his chair, came close to the young man and leaned over with a sneer and said that he could still call him by his name, why Mangek was not very happy. The main meeting room of the Black Banner. In front of the table at which Anso and the vice-captain were sitting stood the squad leaders. Head of the Black Banner Anso, I sat with my eyes closed and my hands folded on my chest and listened to what the vice-captain was saying to everyone present. Vice-captain Dine Zok, who has a scar on his right eye, said that supposedly in 2 days they will make a general attack on the castle on Mount Noho, which the Korean school turned into its base. All squad leaders listened and remembered the words of the vice-captain, who continued to say that the Black Banner decided to take a risk and attack first. The newly arrived Captain Do was also present at this meeting and was very focused. After the vice-captain Dine Zok said that they were leaving immediately and would only move at night, everyone began to disperse. Do stopped because one of the commanders called him. In front of him stood a guy with a bandage on his forehead and with his hands behind him and smiling a little. He said that he had never seen Do and asked him if he was the new captain of the prankster squad. Did not like the words of this captain. He tensed and continued to look at him irritably. The interlocutor extended his hand and said that he was the captain of the Heavenly Detachment Ho Makhun and that he was glad to meet him. Didn't answer him and walked past. Captain Makhun was very surprised by this behavior of his new acquaintance. The thought flashed through the head of the captain of the Heavenly Squad that the captain of the Jokers had ignored him, and he really didn't like that thought. Enraged by this behavior, he turned to Do and, almost shouting, said that this was impolite towards the captain and would he like to introduce himself. Do stopped and looked at Captain Makhun, who continued to say that he follows Han Sung's teachings and by behaving so arrogantly he is greatly insulting other people. Do asked whose teachings he follows and looked contemptuously, almost with hatred in his eyes, at the captain of the Heavenly Detachment. The look of the captain of pranksters, which sent a shiver through Machuan's heart, and sweat began to form on his face. Stopping and holding the hilt of his sword, Do sternly said that he believed only him. Trying to prove he was right, Captain Makhun shouted out that Do was put in charge of a detachment of people who were barely surviving. Clenching his hands into fists, he mockingly continued to say that the captain of such trash as his squad had no right to say anything. But Do simply turned around and began to leave, saying that trash who is on the verge of survival is much better than a dead hero. Night has come. Storm clouds were gathering over the League of Iron. Banner. It was raining heavily when all the troops in black cloaks and with spears on which the banner fluttered moved forward. A huge column of warriors and their captains walked through the forest in the pouring rain that still did not end. Young warrior Mangek, who had 2 sharp spears on his back, purposefully walked forward with his squad. He walked straight behind his new captain and, looking at him, remembered their recent conversation. He told Day that he really wanted to become stronger, to which the captain replied that he must survive at any cost. And he sternly added that being prepared to die will not make him stronger, but only trying to survive will make him strong. While they were walking, Mangek replayed his captain's words in his head. Repeating to himself that he must survive at any cost, the young man became more confident in himself with every step. But then someone suddenly blew right into his ear and heart. Mangek immediately froze in fear. Deciding to play a prank on rookie Banhyo, he said that when she gets wet in the rain she looks even more beautiful. Mangek screamed, but at the same second the elder covered his mouth with his hand to silence him and, putting his index finger to his mouth, shushed him, saying that he should not talk loudly. The rain had stopped pouring, but the clouds covering the sky had not yet cleared. It was decided to stop and make a short halt to discuss the further plan of action. Commander No Kondo told all the other captains that, according to intelligence, about 1/3 of all the people of the Korean school are located on Mount Noho. All the captains were sitting in a small circle, and in the middle of it there were pebbles placed in a circle. Captain Day asked what about the base. Commander No Kondo said that the enemy has only 9 masters, 3 of whom are now on Mount Noho, and began to describe them. He said that on the mountain now there is the 3rd flirting master Ha Hyang-woo, the 6th is the metal pillar Y Tong Jae, and the 9th is the white horse Kong Kushim. Day-do, slightly narrowing his eyes, listened to the commander, who said that if these 3 eliminate their captain and vice-captain, then they will not be able to cope with any of them. He said that even our captain is not sure that he can cope with Ha Hyang, therefore, it is better for them not even to meet his gaze. Understood correctly that if they met him, they would have to run away from the battlefield. Frowning, Commander No Kondo answered him that if he wants to behave like a hero, then he has the right to do it his own way. The commander continued to say that the purpose of their sudden arrival was to get there before the onset of the main military forces and create chaos behind enemy lines. And before the arrival of the main detachment, they must do everything to survive. The commander of the heavenly detachment asked if the enemy now had anyone else besides the captain with a high position, and whether it would be better to take the life of one master than hundreds of insignificant warriors. Crossing his arms over his chest and exhaling dissatisfiedly, Commander N about Kondo said that if it is possible to implement this, then let him take it and do it. Continuing to tell his plan, the commander showed their strategy on the stones, saying that the 1st and 2nd squads will burst in from the left side, and the 3rd, 4th and 5th from the right. He said that they were in the 5th detachment and asked all the commanders who would lead them. Commander Mak Hun shouted and, hitting the ground with his hand, asked that the heavenly detachment be allowed to do this. And looking carefully at Commander No Kondo, he eagerly awaited a positive answer from him. Day-do, in turn, tensely waited for what Commander No Jongdo would say. For a second, the commander closed his eyes to think about his decision and said that a squad of jokers would do this. Everyone present accepted the commander's order, but only the commander of the heavenly squad, Mak Hun, was dissatisfied with this. At that very moment, Commander No Kondo ordered their operation to begin immediately, and all the commanders dispersed to their detachments. Day-do walked forward without turning around, and Mak Hun looked at his back with clenched fists. He watched him with fury and quietly repeated his name with hatred. Black clouds were gathering over Mount Noho. Many high rocks were visible. Fog shrouded the mountain slopes. If you climbed high on them and looked down, you wouldn't see the ground. They walked along a small ledge on this mountain. Wrapped in ropes, the squad of jokers slowly made their way forward step by step. The elder's hand lightly touched the rock and small stones immediately fell down. Removing his hand, the elder thought that if he touched the cliff, it would immediately begin to crumble. The entire detachment stood at a great height with their backs pressed to the slope. Seeing the stones falling down, the elder thought that this landslide could be used for a surprise attack. Looking up, he came to the idea that there was a possibility that they could slide down along with the rocks and be buried alive. They continued to move slowly up the mountain. The elder staggered a little and saw this. Mangek stole a glance at his feet. At that moment, the rock under the elder's feet began to collapse and stones fell down. The rocky rock disappeared from under his feet and he began to fall into the cliff. Commander Day-do noticed this and grabbed the rope to hold him back. The common rope around which all members of the squad were wrapped tightened and pulled Ma along with it. Bangoka K. A second later also began to fall into the abyss. Banhyo strained his entire body to stay on his feet and not fall along with them. From the tension, sweat appeared on his head, a vein appeared on his head, and he clenched his teeth so hard that they began to groan. Commander Day-do and Banhyo stood motionless like stones while Elder and Ma Bangek hung over the abyss. Ma Bangek was very frightened, grabbed the rope with both hands and screamed, pressing his legs to his chest. Banhyo, barely able to stand on his feet, shouted at the recruit to stop screaming. He grabbed the rope with one hand and the rock wall with the other hand, and told the recruit that if he screamed, their whole plan would fail and they would all die. Ma Bangek, with tears in his eyes, covered his mouth with one hand to stop screaming and looked down in fear. Banhyo grabbed the rope with both hands, trying to hold them and asked the captain what they should do next. 2 warriors from their squad hung over the unknown. At any moment the rope can break and they will fly into the abyss. Commander Day-do looked at them for a long time, thinking about how best to act in this situation. And finally, having made a decision, he confidently took the hilt of his sword, still looking down at his warriors. The commander of the prankster squad took his sword out of its sheath in one motion. Banhyo, I once looked at the commander and thought that he wanted to sacrifice 2 people. But the next moment Day-do stuck his sword into the rock almost to the hilt. And holding on to his sword, he began to wrap the rope around his hand, thereby saving his people. Banhyo exhaled and smiled, and the thought ran through his head that the commander was softer than he thought. All the warriors of this detachment held their breath, and the commander and Banhyo began to help the fallen return to duty. And here's Ma's hand. Bangoka caught on the ledge and he began to slowly pull himself up to get out. And so he, trembling and out of breath, almost made it back to the rock, numb from shock. Banhyo with a smile told the recruit that he was doing well and that before he would have shouted all the time, but now he was silent. Banhyo helped the recruit get out, and Captain Day-do, holding his sword, helped the elder. And now the elder finally climbed the slope. He was trembling, trying to catch his breath, and looked at the chip that caused him to fall and pull one of his comrades with him. The elder turned to the captain and asked for forgiveness, but Day-do just looked at him and did not answer. Then the captain looked down at the rope and thought that when he pulled, the weight decreased sharply. He looked at the team members who had just escaped and thought that perhaps 1 or even 2 were studying Qigong. Meanwhile, Banhyo told them to concentrate. Knitting his eyebrows, the elder looked gloomily at the commander and wondered if he had noticed anything. He also thought that at his age he was in debt. And the commander, in turn, looked confidently forward. It was the dead of night. The moon peeked out from behind the clouds and illuminated a small town. The squad of pranksters continued to advance forward. And now they have already left that dangerous path to land. The commander looked out from behind the rock to see if anyone had noticed them. He peered into the darkness and with some kind of bad feeling said that it was suspiciously quiet here. He gathered his entire squad to discuss further actions. Day-do said that when the operation begins they will go back. Everyone understood what their commander No-ma was talking about. Mangek was very surprised by his words. He did not understand why their transfer detachment would have to retreat during the operation. The commander looked sternly at the young man and reminded him that he said that he wanted to be stronger. The commander continued to say that if he wants to live to see the day when he becomes strong, then Ma Bangek must do everything as he says. Remembering the commander's words, the recruit nodded and decided to obey him in everything. Stars were visible in the sky. The wind blew, blowing the flags at the gates of the enemy base. The commander said that the operation had begun and everyone rushed forward. The entire squad of jokers ran after the captain, skirting small stones on their way. A moment later, Commander Day-do suspected something was wrong. He had a bad feeling. He put his fist up, indicating that everyone should stop. The entire squad immediately froze and the commander ordered everyone to press against the wall. The warriors, following the order of the commander and squatting, held their breath. They waited for his next instructions. Anso and the vice-captain appeared from around the corner Dine Zok. He said that there was no one at this base. The detachment of Commander No Kondo was approaching them. The vice-captain asked them if they had met the enemy on their side. Coming closer, Commander No Kondo said with a frown that they had not met anyone. He suggested that either intelligence could give false information about the base or the enemy had already relocated. Commander Anso closed his eyes and began to think carefully about the current situation. And a moment later he ordered all troops to immediately retreat. The next second, hundreds of thousands of fiery arrows were already flying at them. One of the enemy's arrows flew like a comet and landed right next to the prankster squad. The elder turned to Commander Day-Do and said in alarm that it was a trap. But the captain didn't answer him. Discouraged by the fact that Commander Day-Do says nothing and does not take any action, Mangek said that Captain Anso had just ordered a retreat. Turning to the recruit, the squad captain told him not to worry and to wait. At this time, the heavenly squad, led by its commander, following orders, left the battlefield. Captain Day-Do saw Machuan's squad fleeing. Running at high speed, Makhun saw a squad of jokers with their commander sitting pressed against the wall. Having lost his vigilance, the commander of the heavenly detachment tripped over a stone and, having flown several meters, fell face down. He lay on the ground while his squad continued to run further. He raised his head and saw Day-Do down at Commander Makhun with cold blood and contempt. Having risen to his haunches, the commander of the heavenly detachment looked bashfully at Day-Do and his detachment. Unable to withstand such tension, he rushed headlong to run away from there, leaving his spear lying on the ground. The entire squad of jokers watched as the warriors left the battlefield in an unknown direction. The elder told his commander that there was a cliff where the heavenly squad was running. A second later, raising his spear, Day-Do said that getting here was already a difficult task, and if they were attacked while they were descending from the cliff, then they would not have a chance to survive. Mangek offered to dissuade everyone from running, but the commander, holding a spear in his hand, said that it was useless. He sternly said that fear clouds the mind and at this time a person begins to move instinctively. At that moment, the enemy launched another rain of fiery arrows, and Commander Day-Do jumped out of his seat and ran and ordered that now, before the enemy fired arrows for the third time, they would break into their camp, a small town located on a cliff. The enemy commander looked at him and thought that this place would become the grave of the Iron Banner. Holding a metal board in his hands, he said that no one would leave here alive, but they could meekly give up and go to his school. But before he could finish his speech, he saw that someone's spear was rushing towards him at great speed. He barely managed to place the iron plate so that the spear would hit it, thereby blocking this blow. A squad of jokers was already rushing towards him, and Day-Do, who was running ahead, shouted that anyone who would interfere with him would die. With an uncontrollable desire to win, the commander gave the order to run only forward, even if the enemy stood in their way. And so a fierce battle began. All units entered into a fierce battle with their enemy. Swinging his sword over his head, the man shouted that if he did not kill even young people on the battlefield, he himself would die. Mangek screamed in fear, ducked down and, trying to protect himself, covered his face with his hands. But the young man was saved by the elder, who at that moment cut off the enemy's head with one movement of his sword. Blood splashed in all directions and fell on the recruit. And at that moment he froze in a daze. Furiously, he looked at his hands and realized that fear had frozen his mind and he was moving instinctively. The stars in the sky are visible behind the clouds. The full moon illuminates the path for courageous warriors. Detachment of jokers ran along the forest road behind their commander, resolutely looking only forward. Commander Day-Do stopped abruptly, silently raised his fist, and his entire squad froze in place. Day-Do listened warily and pointed somewhere to the side with his index finger. The moon, surrounded by 1,000 stars, illuminated the dense forests and winding paths. Pressed against a large stone, the commander listened long and intently to the silence. Then he turned to his squad and said that here they could rest a little. The warriors immediately went limp and fell to the ground from fatigue. Day-Do ordered his squad to come to their senses while there is still time. Banhyo, sitting on the earth, held his spear in his hands and sighed heavily. He looked at Mangek, who stood with his back to him. was breathing heavily, looking at the floor and holding one spear tightly in both hands. Manhwa stood up and patted the recruit on the shoulder with a smile and said that he fought well. Ma's eyes the Bangoka were blazing with rage. He seemed to be in a fog and, swinging his spear, he sharply turned to his comrade. His spears, already at breakneck speed, were ready to strike. Manhwa, not realizing that spears were about to pierce him, froze in place. But in the blink of an eye, Commander Do flew up to the soldiers, stopped the blow with one hand and looked angrily at Ma Bangoka. He threateningly told him that fear fetters the mind and a person begins to act instinctively and that he had already told him this. Waking up as if from a bad dream, the recruit saw the captain holding his weapon. Manhwa got angry and hit him on the back of the head, saying that he scared him very much. Then Elder P approached the recruit and said, looking at his left hand, that he had been hit with a spear in a fight. While treating and bandaging the wound, the elder said that fortunately the wound was shallow, and everything else was just ordinary scratches. Ma Mangek looked in horror at his bloody hands and asked how there was so much blood on his hands. The elder asked if he remembered anything. The young warrior shook his head negatively, but then the memories of that terrible battle suddenly returned to him, and in order not to scream, he covered his mouth with his hands. The elder stood next to the recruit who was shaking from everything that was happening and thought that this guy was also unusual. The elder approached the squad leader and reported that no one was seriously injured. He said that it seemed that their squad managed to escape first and asked his commander when they would leave next. To which Do replied that they would leave after the arrival of the main forces. Looking at Do, the elder thought that they were hiding here not only from the enemy, but also so that the main army would attack the first. There were most likely traps on the retreat route, so their commander wanted to send the main army first. And I decided to ask him if he wanted to join them. The commander looked closely at the elder and asked him if he wanted to become a hero. The elder straightforwardly and firmly said that he did not want to become a hero. And then he asked the captain who was standing on guard if the main detachment would be able to escape. Do looked at the elder and confidently said that their leader was not a weakling at all. Standing against the backdrop of buildings blazing in flames from the battle, the commander of the enemy army, trembling with rage, pronounced the name Anso, repeating it over and over again. The flames quickly spread throughout the building. Enemy soldiers finished off the warriors of the Iron Banner. Their commander stood looking forward furiously and continued to repeat Anso's name while his subordinate bandaged his wounds. One of the warriors of the enemy squad approached Mr. Y Tong Jae from behind and told him to calm down. To which the gentleman did not answer, but only looked at him furiously. Manhwa continued to say that the warriors of the Iron Banner would not be able to leave that mountain alive. Mr. Y Tong Jae smiled evilly and said that this is indeed true, because there are only two ways out of there. From the starry sky one could see a mountain gorge shrouded in thick fog. The moon completely illuminated this gorge when troops from the Iron Banner entered it. Commander Anso stopped to understand where to go next, and Captain N.O. Kondo, holding a mace in one hand, pulled out two enemy arrows with his other hand. He broke them in half and threw the top part on the ground. And the other part still remained in his body. He turned to look at all the remaining living warriors, looked around them and asked, "Are everyone here that survived the war?" Commander Anso looked forward resolutely and thought that there was only one way out. A moment later, he told all the troops to run as quickly as possible and they all rushed forward as fast as they could. They quickly ran along the gorge and expected that the enemy was about to attack. And then Commander Anso and Captain N about Kondo noticed something but did not stop and continued to run forward. But Kondo, alarmed, told the commander that it was strange that there was no ambush in such a convenient place for escape. But at that very second, Commander Anso saw something very serious ahead. He raised his fist up so that everyone would stop and the entire squad would freeze in place. They saw first one torch in front of them and then another. Two torches illuminated the enemy army that stood at the exit from this gorge. And at the head of this army was the third master of the school, Kurian Hyang Wool, about whom Captain No Kondo had previously spoken. He waited with his army for the troops of the Iron Banner to come running into his trap. Captain No Jongdo shouted in horror that the person who was now standing in front of them was the flirting Hyang Wool. Commander Anso, without hesitation and looking menacingly at the enemy, with one movement, unsheathed his sword, ready for battle. Master Ha Hyang-woo raised one hand up so that all his warriors prepared for the attack, and the two archers who stood next to him immediately pulled the string on their bows. Commander Anso gloomily thought that the enemies had decided to set up an ambush here. But if they managed to take away the torches, they would have a chance to escape in the dark. The flirting Ha Hyang-woo looked intently at Anso and realized that he had some kind of plan. Having made a decision, Commander Anso took a decisive step forward, thereby showing the enemy his readiness for battle. Still holding his hand up, the third master of the Korean school said that Captain Anso was known as an excellent killer and suggested that the Iron Banner surrender. Illuminated by the torch, the enemy archers were already in full combat readiness and awaiting the order of their commander. Rushing into the attack, Anso furiously shouted that negotiations were useless. The flirting Ha Hyang-woo looked at him displeasedly and waved his hand forward, giving an order to his squad. And a second later, in the detachment of iron banners, thousands of arrows flew. Commander Anso rushed forward. He tried to dodge the enemy attacks so that, if possible, the arrows did not hit him. He maneuvered and cut the arrows with his sword to put his plan into action. He was able to hit one torch and, like lightning, headed towards the other. Seeing what Asno Ha Hyang-woo was up to, he ordered his archers to shoot even harder. But an instant later one of the torches flew at him at breakneck speed. Without moving from his place, with one movement of his large iron claws he threw away the torch flying towards him. Then a cloud of fire appeared right in front of him and suddenly jumped out of it. He used fire as a diversionary technique and struck his first blow to Han Hyang-wil, but he blocked it in time with his iron claws. All the other warriors of the Iron Banner, led by Captain N.O. Kondo, also rushed into battle. The commander of the enemy archers shouted for them to shoot even faster, and the warriors did everything to fulfill this order. The battle began under fire. Anso was in a fight with the master of the Korean school and was not inferior to him in skill. When Anso was ready to strike the next blow, Hyang-woo got distracted by something and looked to the side. Captain No Jongdo wanted to strike him unexpectedly, but Ha Hyang-woo quickly noticed this and was able to dodge. This was a diversionary maneuver, and thanks to this, the Iron Banner detachment was able to break through this ambush and exit the gorge. Looking after them, the flirting Ha Hyang-woo was furiously thinking about Captain Anso and that he wanted to meet him again. The night was long. The Blue River flows between hillsides and mountain forests. One of the enemy arrows hit the commander of the Iron Banner in the side and blood flowed from his wound. But he and his entire squad ran away from the battlefield as quickly as possible despite their injuries. The commanders and warriors fled along the road through the mountain forests in the hope that they would soon be able to get out and rest. Commander No Kondo, who had two new enemy arrows in his back, looked at the wounded Anso. He turned his head back and, looking at the warriors who were standing on their feet with all their strength, he thought that he needed to run away from here as quickly as possible. All the warriors of the Iron Banner rushed headlong from this ill-fated mountain. Finally leaving the mountain behind, exhausted, they came to the intersection of two roads. They stopped to rest. The warriors were depressed, but they were glad that they were still able to leave that hated mountain. Commander N.O. Kondo put his mace on the ground and closed his eyes and exhaled with relief. When everyone had already relaxed and thought that everything was already behind, Commander Anso sharply hit the stone with his sword and all the warriors immediately turned their attention to him. After that, he pointed his sword forward and everyone present was shocked and depressed by what they saw. Ahead stood the enemy's cavalry army, which was already waiting for the Iron Banner detachment. But Kondo set his teeth and thought that there was an ambush here too, but no matter how quickly they ran from the cavalry, they would not be able to escape. With their eyes burning even in the darkness with rage, the warriors of the enemy army sat on their horses and awaited orders from their commander. One horse took a few steps forward, loudly striking the ground with its hooves. In front of the Iron Banner detachment stood a white terrible horse on which sat the commander of the enemy army. Holding his horse in rein, he contemptuously said that Captain Anso was smaller than he imagined and added that this was probably because he looked down on him. Wounded Anso stood right in front of him, holding a sword in his hand and did not take his angry gaze off him. The cavalry commander said with a grin to one of his warriors that the nickname of the killer Anso does not suit him at all. He continued to say that despite his appearance, Anso is said to be one of the 10 strongest people in the Iron Banner League. Chain appeared at the end of which there was a sharp metal needle. Holding a weapon in his hand, the commander of the cavalry detachment said that he decided to give Anso the honor of dying from the silver chain of the white horse of Kong Kushim, and while continuing to sit on his horse, he began to swing this chain at a very high speed. But Kondo, ready to engage in battle, asked the captain to allow him to fight with him. But Anso blocked his path with his sword. He decided to deal with the cavalry captain himself and took a few steps towards him. But Kondo was concerned about his captain's decision and was very worried about him since he was already wounded in a previous battle. With sweat on his face, tired and almost exhausted, Anso held his sword with trembling hands. The commander of the enemy detachment, unwinding his chain even more, was already completely ready for their fight. But then the entire Iron Banner detachment looked back tensely because someone was approaching them from behind. It was a detachment of jokers led by Captain Dede, who was immediately ready to join the battle. When they arrived, all the other warriors of the Iron Banner made way for them. Assessing the situation on the battlefield, Dede said that there was no way back from here, and the elder answered him that if they didn't figure it out here at all, they would be pursued one by one and then killed. Dede, taking a few steps forward, ordered his squad to kill the commander and kill the remaining enemy. At that very second, a detachment of jokers boldly rushed to the attack following the order of their commander. Running next to the commander, the elder said that he did not want to become a hero, to which Dede answered him that it was so. And looking forward furiously, he added that he should not, but was only trying to survive. Banhyo ran to his enemy and thought that after they dealt with them, they would ride on their own horses. But Kondo was very surprised that the squad of jokers decided to join the battle. The enemy cavalry commander stuck his arm out to the side and pointed his chain at his opponent. The metal needle rushed towards Ma at high speed. Bangoka, who ran to the attack holding spears in his hands. Banhyo put his spear in front of the recruit and the chain spun around him, thereby protecting his comrade. The chain wrapped around the blade of the spear several times and Banhyo shouted enthusiastically that he had caught it. When the cavalry commander saw that his capture was successful, he closed his eyes for a second and smiled and then sharply kicked his horse on the sides. At that very second the horse stood on its hind legs and its rider began to pull the chain towards him. After this, the chain that was wound around the blade of P's spear pulled Banhyo behind it. He did not want to let go of his weapon and put his legs forward and tried to resist. The elder told Banhyo to immediately let go of his weapon during this fight. But Banhyo didn't even think about giving up. He took the chain with one hand and answered the elder that if he grabbed it, he would not let go until he lost all his teeth. When the captain of the cavalry detachment saw that Banhyo did not let go of the chain with his weapon, he turned his horse around and pulled the chain even stronger. Banhyo trying to cope with his opponent, he held on with all his might until the last moment. But then his body could not withstand the tension and his hand let go of the chain. He was thrown back, fell on the elder and knocked him down. Within a moment, the warrior on horseback was victoriously holding his opponent's spear above his head while Banhyo and the elder were lying on the ground. Examining the new trophy, the cavalry commander said that this weapon could not be called beautiful. One of the enemy warriors immediately warned his commander about the next attacker. Dede was already rapidly rushing to meet his opponent. Seeing this, the rider dropped the spear from his hands. Furiously, he pointed the chain at his new opponent, noticing that he was acting very bravely. Dede was easily and quickly able to dodge this attack by lunging to the side. Having fallen to the ground, he decided to slide under the horse and try to knock it off its feet. The commander of the cavalry detachment did not expect that his enemy would climb right under his horse and, angry, he shouted that Dede was a little rat. Watching this fight, Anso thought that the chain was moving unpredictably and therefore Dede decided to slip under the horse where it could not reach. The captain of the squad of jokers was already right under the horse, and so that he would not break his bones, Dede dodged as best he could. The cavalry commander was very unhappy about this. In a rage, he shouted to his horse to run over his opponent. Dede, concentrating, caught the right moment, took out his sword and struck straight into the horse's belly. At that same second, the horse reared up in pain and threw its rider out of the saddle. He fell to the ground with a crash, hitting his back and writhing in pain. A moment later, one of the warriors of the enemy army was already galloping to the aid of his master. But two spears blocked his way. The horse stood up on its hind legs in fright, and the warrior, holding on to the bridle, almost flew out of the saddle. Ma stood resolutely in front of him Mangek, and without letting him go ahead, he said that he was his rival. Dai-Du and the commander of the cavalry detachment locked eyes with each other, making it clear to their opponent that no one intended to lose, while a recruit from the jester squad decided to test his strength and rebel against a strong enemy. The white horse of the cavalry troop commander lay on the ground while he looked at Dai-Du already ready for battle and waving his chain. And sitting on a horse, a warrior of the enemy army was ready to engage in battle with Ma Bangekam. The cavalry commander looked at his opponent angrily and clearly. He furrowed his eyebrows and curled his mouth. And the commander of the squad of jokers lunged to the side, grabbed his sword and resolutely looked at his enemy. The cavalry commander was the first to start this battle. He began to unwind his chain even more. Then he lunged forward and made his first blow, pointing his chain directly at Dai-Du. The needle at the end of the chain was already near Dai-Du in the blink of an eye, but he was able to dodge it in time. He watched the cavalry commander move and thought that his speed was unimaginable. Dai-Du, retreating back so as not to fall under the enemy's chain, jumped over his horse, which was lying on the ground. He stood behind the horse in such a way that it was right between the enemies and the next blow of the chain hit it directly. The cavalry commander continued to swing his chain while Dai-Du stared at the horse for a second. He was shocked that with one blow of the chain his opponent easily took off the horse's head. Continuing to unwind his chain more and more, the commander of the cavalry detachment said that now it was Dai-Du's turn. He continued to rotate his chain and its silhouette already resembled an atom. Dai-Du looked at his opponent and thought that if he did not rotate his chain in a certain way, he would lose. He lunged to the side, dodging the blow of the chain, and then quickly began to move towards his enemy. Seeing that Dai-Du had begun his movement, the cavalry commander smiled at the fact that he was coming straight into his paws and made his next blow. The sharp needle at the end of the chain flew straight at Dai-Du, who no longer had time to dodge. He blocked the blow with his sword, crossing his arms over his chest. But the blow was so strong that the shock wave threw him several meters away. He flew through the air. When he landed on his feet, trying to stop the movement, he slid back a little more. From this blow, his sword began to smoke, and Dai-Du himself thought that his opponent had very enormous destructive power. He looked at the cavalry commander who stood confidently on two legs and his straight chain was directed into the sky. Smiling evilly, the commander of the enemy army told his enemy to die and strike again. Dai-Du was able to dodge this blow by jumping back and the chain hit the ground. The chain, as if alive, continued to pursue its opponent, who retreated back all the time and struck blow after blow. Having returned the chain to himself, the cavalry commander said that thanks to Dai-Du, it became interesting for him to fight, but he did not understand how a low-class warrior could be capable of such a thing. Tired of numerous attacks, the commander of the squad of jokers knitted his eyebrows and looked straight at his enemy, trembling and breathing heavily. And another fight between an enemy cavalry warrior and Ma Bangekam was just beginning. The recruit looked back to see how things were going with his captain, who was also fighting now. But at this time Ma's opponent Bangoka decided to strike first. Sitting on a horse, the enemy struck with his spear, but the young warrior of the Iron Banner managed to reflect this blow by crossing his spears in front of him. His opponent was angry that Ma Mangek is not focused on his fight and looks away all the time. Watching this fight, the elder thought that his comrade was fighting with short spears against a cavalryman with long ones, and the length of the spear was very important. The cavalryman sat on his horse holding his weapon in one hand and looked at Ma Bangoka from top to bottom. Then he struck again with his next blow. A blow from above is much stronger than a blow from below, but Ma Bangek withstood this force and again crossed his spears and blocked it. The elder thought that if his comrade wanted to win this fight, then he should knock down the enemy with the horse, as the captain did, and shouted to him to attack the horse. Making his next blow, the cavalryman said that he would not allow himself to be pushed off his horse. To dodge this blow, Bangek immediately jumped up decisively. Holding one spear in his hand, he jumped so high that his opponent did not expect this and was very surprised. Then, swinging, he brought two spears together behind his back to strike at his enemy. To dodge this blow from the recruit, the cavalryman had to lean back and lie on his horse. The cavalryman stood up and, becoming even more angry, also wanted to strike his next blow. But when he was about to do this, he saw that Ma Bangek disappeared and only members of his squad stood far ahead. But suddenly a shadow appeared behind the cavalryman, and he felt someone's presence. He turned sharply back and delivered his blow, fully confident that his opponent was right behind him. A second after this blow, he was amazed by what he saw with his own eyes. Leg Ma Bangoka lightly touched the blade of the spear and stood on his opponent's weapon. It seemed like he was hanging in the air, but in reality he was just standing on the blade of a spear. The elder saw this ability of his comrade. He was surprised and realized that he was using the Qin Gong technique. Stealthily looking at his ward, Commander Dai Di told himself that he had already guessed about this. And that when he and Elder Wu fell into the abyss it was because of Ma Bangoka rope then became easier. At that same second, the enraged cavalryman removed his spear and Ma Bangek calmly jumped off him. As if nothing had happened, he landed on his feet right in front of his opponent. The cavalryman, a little frightened by the abilities of this young warrior, asked him what kind of person he was. He watched as Ma Bangek fights hard with one of the enemy cavalry warriors. Commander Anso closely followed this fight and remembered when he first saw Ma Bangoka. The weather was beautiful that day when young Ma Bangek came to the Black Banner party. The Black Banner employees called Anso and Commander No Kondo to introduce them to a new warrior. He said with a smile on his face that they accepted this boy. Ma Bangek stood next to him with his hands in fists and lifelessly looking at the floor. Commander No Kondo looked closely at the boy and asked what his name was. Raising his eyes, the young warrior sluggishly and reluctantly said that his name was Ma. But Kondo continued to question his new acquaintance and asked him what he specialized in, to which the young man replied that he owned spears. Commander Anso silently peered at the recruit, and No Kondo asked in surprise who taught him how to use spears. Ma Bangek, gloomily lowering his eyes to the floor, did not answer. Anso at that moment thought that since the recruit's surname is Ma and he wields spears, then he really is a child who grew up in the mountains. They stood opposite each other, tense in this fight, waiting for who would make the next blow. And then the cavalryman jumps from his horse to the ground, ready to continue the fight. He swings and, lunging to the side, strikes with his spear. Anso, who was watching this battle, thought that this rookie, thanks to his Qin Gong technique, forced the person who had the upper hand to get off his horse. The cavalryman, holding his spear with both hands, immediately rushed to attack the young warrior. Because this kid was forcing him to fight seriously, he struck his blow with rage. But he didn't know that Ma Bangek is proficient in the spear technique. He jumped up and, spinning his small spears in his hands, quickly moved towards his enemy. The rookie at high speed began to strike his opponent blow after blow, and the cavalryman could barely keep up with him to reflect his blows. The battle between the enemy commander of the cavalry detachment and the commander of the jester detachment was in full swing. The D, fully prepared to attack, holding his sword, decisively rushed forward towards his enemy. The commander of the mounted detachment O was glad that his opponent had begun to act and again swung his chain at him. When the needle on the tip of the chain flew past his owner, he kicked it like a soccer ball towards the opponent. At incredible speed, she flew towards Dai Du, but at the last moment he was able to turn away from her. The cavalry commander returned it to him and, in a jump, again launched his enemy weapon. The needle flew at great speed at the captain of the jester squad, but this time he could not dodge it and it hit him right in the head. Dai Do flew away from the blow and fell straight to the ground. The commander of the cavalry detachment returned his chain to himself and watched as his opponent, struck by his blow, slid along the ground. Commander Anso tensed up seeing how Dai Du began to lose to Ma Bangek was afraid for his captain. After such a strong blow, Dai Do slowly began to get back to his feet. She could barely stand on her feet and holding the sword in her left hand with her right hand, he held his head. When he removed his hand from the wound on his forehead, blood flowed straight into his eye. Because of the blood, he could only see out of one eye. The cavalry captain, smiling evilly, said that he recognizes Dai Di's endurance because even after being hit with a chain right in the head, he is still standing on his feet. He stopped his chain, and it hung with a needle down above the ground. After that, he said that he intended to finish this guy and do it with his chain. After these words, the needle at the tip of his chain opened and 5 very sharp small needles appeared. The Do held his hand on his wound and, thinking that he could not lose consciousness at this moment and trying to come up with at least some kind of plan, looked at his opponent. While the cavalry commander had already begun swinging his improved chain towards him. At this very moment, Dai Do remembered all his previous attacks. He analyzed that when the chain is long he can see the movement of the tip and evade it. But when the enemy reduces the length of the chain, the speed becomes higher and it is harder to dodge. While Dae-do came to his senses and tried to come up with a plan of action, the cavalry commander took another step back, turning his chain faster and faster. Dae-do, looking at his enemy with one eye, decided how he would attack him further. And then, without even a second, he jumped out of his seat and rushed into battle again. When he ran up to his opponent, he was able to open his second eye and follow the movement of the chain by putting his free hand to the side. The hand that he put out to the side at all his speed was wrapped in a chain and he clenched his teeth in pain. He realized, looking at his enemy, that if he could not get closer to him, then he himself would pull him towards him with the help of his own weapon. And the next second, the commander of the detachment, Shudov, pulled the chain towards himself with all his strength. When he did this, out of surprise, the commander of the cavalry detachment leaned forward a little, but at the last moment he was able to stop. He looked at Dae-do with fury and tried to cope with the fact that his enemy was pulling him towards him. But then he took out his other target and immediately opened its tip so that there were 5 sharp needles. And unwinding his second chain in his other hand, he told his opponent that it was useless to reduce the distance between them. But Dae-do did not give up. And following his plan, he let go of his sword in order to intercept it and take it more comfortably. Then he threw it with all his strength. Gaining momentum, Dae-do's sword rushed straight towards the cavalry commander. But he, swinging his second chain, was able to fight him off and the sword flew to the side. Smiling maliciously, the cavalry commander said that the last thing Dae-do was capable of was throwing his weapon at him. He was furious that the battle was dragging on and, deciding to end it quickly, he aimed his second chain at the enemy. Dae-do watched in horror as the 5-pointed needle at the end of the chain approached him at great speed. At that same second, a powerful blow occurred and the enemy's chain hit the captain of the jester squad directly. Taking a break from his fight, Mangek watched his captain's battle and worried about him with tears in his eyes. Blood slowly collected from Dae-do's wounds and dripped onto the ground in a small hand. Feeling the taste of victory, the captain of the cavalry detachment said that it was a boring battle. But he was surprised to realize that the battle was not over yet and the enemy continued to pull him towards him. Putting his palm forward, Dae-do deliberately caught the second chain, allowing it to wound himself in the arm. The cavalry captain was very amazed and asked how he was able to catch his second chain. To which the elder who watched this battle said that from the very beginning the chain with a small range of rotation could not gain enough strength. Crying out in pain, but not about to give up, Dae-do rushed at his opponent to hit him back. Confused, the captain of the cavalry detachment, seeing his enemy approaching him, trembled and thought that this could not happen. And at that same second, Dae-do struck his enemy's head with the tip of the chain. Blood gushed from the cavalry commander's head. At this time, Dae-do was holding his enemy's weapon in both hands. At that moment, the enemy cavalry warrior saw that his commander had been hit and shouted with rage that this was impossible. And at the same time, Dae-do, in some kind of rage, struck his opponent blow after blow. From these countless blows, drops of blood flew in different directions. Having finished off his opponent, Dae-do, out of breath, looked down at him and he began to let go of the chains from his hands. Dae-do's sword was somewhere in the distance and he himself stood in front of his enemy, watching him bleed. Trembling with rage, one of the cavalry warriors watched this picture. In a rage, he pointed his finger forward at the Iron Banner detachment and ordered all the warriors to attack. The enemy cavalry warriors had been waiting for this order for a very long time and eagerly wanted to carry it out. Commander Anso took his sword with both hands and held it forward in preparation for another battle. Rising from the earth, Captain No Kondo said that he had rested enough so he would also fight. Anticipating a bloody battle, Banhyo shouted with a crazy smile that today they would all die. He was looking forward to this battle starting. The cavalry detachment of the Kurian school began its attack on the Iron Banner detachment and the decisive battle began. Mangek wielding his 2 spears, he repelled all the blows and fought with several cavalrymen at once. There were a lot of wounded and killed on the ground in this confrontation. The earth was smoking from this battle. One of the cavalry captains said that they would stop beating around the bush and that now they would all attack together. The entire cavalry detachment made a small semicircle to gather all its warriors and was quickly heading towards its opponents. But then the captain of the cavalry detachment saw something and clenched his teeth furiously. Clatter of hooves could be heard, which became stronger and louder with every second. The sun rose from behind the mountains, illuminating the morning sky. The main detachment of the Iron Banner League hastily arrived on the battlefield for reinforcements, carrying with them a banner with the inscription of steadfastness. Finally, after a long night, morning came. The sun illuminated the sky and the palace of the Iron Banner League. The right hand of the head, Sopyong, walked towards him with the head of the Iron Banner to give him a report on the past operation. He entered the meeting room, stopped in front of the head and was silent for several seconds, choosing his words. Banner sat in a chair at a long table, resting his head on one hand. He looked at Sopyong, waiting for what he would tell him. Looking closely at him, he realized that Sopyong brought him bad news. Standing directly in front of the head, he said that the plan for a surprise attack had failed. Before Sopyong's eyes there were terrible pictures from that battle, how the fiery arrows of the enemies fell straight into the warriors of the Black Banner. Korean school had learned of their strategy and the stymied members of the Black Banner were trying to escape from their attack. But when they fled through the gorge on the way back, many were killed due to a trap set. Anso's detachment met the third master of the school, Korean Ha Hyang-woo, and not without losses, but they were able to escape from him. Seopyeong continued to report that 207 people took part in the surprise attack, and among them, 154 died or went missing. He said that after they managed to escape from the set trap, a total of 53 warriors remained, of which 22 were seriously wounded and 31 had minor wounds. But then they met an enemy cavalry detachment, and if the main army had been late, none of them would have survived. When the main army joined the Black Banner detachment, the cavalry army of the Korean school hastily retreated from the battlefield. Sopyong said that this was the worst defeat since the creation of the Iron Banner. In that battle, Commander No Kondo lost one arm, but continuing his report, he said that even in such a situation, they were able to kill the master of the Korean school, Cavalry Commander Kong Kushim. The head of the Iron Banner, after Sopyong finished his report, sighed heavily and, after thinking, asked after a second who killed Kong Kushim. Seopyeong said that it was the new captain of the Jester Squad, Dae-do. The head was very surprised by this statement. Dae-do was able to defeat Kong Kushim with his own weapon, 2 chains with sharp tips. Sopyong continued to tell that in his squad of 10 people, 7 survived and it had the highest survival rate relative to all other squads. The head frowned, put his hand to his face and tried to remember who this Dae-do was. Sopyong, throwing up his hands, asked the head of N whether it was necessary to find out more about the new captain of the Jester Squad, to which the head gave his consent and said that this information might be useful to him. After that, he said with concern that all the information about this operation had been checked several times, but still the impeccably prepared surprise attack had failed, which meant that there was an information leak. Closing his eyes, Sopyong said in frustration that this is how it is. The head of the banner continued to reason. He said that with the exception of management, no one else knew about the upcoming operation. He crossed his fingers in front of his face and concluded that there was a spy within the Iron Banner League. It was already day and the sun was high above Mount Noho. In the gorge where the Black Banner detachment fell into an enemy trap, there were many killed soldiers. A soldier climbed onto the hill of dead warriors and stretched his arms down and looked up. It was the captain of the Sky Squad Makhun. Climbing higher, he looked at the battlefield in the hope of finding one of the survivors. But to his regret, he did not find anyone and decided to go back to his own people. Smoke billowed over the city. This place was shrouded in darkness and fog and all the warriors wore cloaks. The Red Gold Gorge in Gansu province is the main headquarters of the Korean school, over which there was always black smoke and the sky was burgundy scarlet. Several people stood in a semicircle near some device and watched it being repaired. There were a lot of pipes and wires around. The girl who had finished repairing the device wiped her forehead with the hand in which she was holding a wrench and said that now everything should work. This girl was the deputy head of the Korean Dok Ko Chongchon school. She turned to one of the workers and told him to pull the lever. Worker P put his hand on the lever and pulled it down. The next second, steam came out of the car that was being repaired and one of the repairmen joyfully shouted that everything was working. The heavy elevator cabin, which was located deep underground, began to rise to the top. Several people who worked at this enterprise were eagerly waiting for this elevator to rise. When he arrived and the doors opened, there were men standing there with bandages covering their mouths and with a huge cart of coal. They started to exit the elevator. One of the workers rolled the cart along the rails, and everyone else began to talk with their comrades. A man with a shovel behind his back scratched the back of his head and told his comrade that he thought that if everything had not gone according to plan, he would have died down there. But he answered him that everything worked out thanks to the deputy head. Deputy head Chanshan walked towards them with her team and said that they had fixed everything. When she approached two workers, she said that if problems with the mechanism arise again, they should not hesitate to call her, especially if it is a device that she made herself. But at that moment one of the workers ran and called the deputy head and everyone turned their attention to him. Deputy Chief Jiangkan had a bad feeling as she looked at the guy running up to her. After the news that he brought her, she rushed to the palace. In front of the entrance to the main hall, two guards with spears stood and saw the deputy head rushing towards them at full speed. The guards were dismayed when she abruptly opened the door and began calling her father from the threshold. When she entered the hall where the commanders were sitting at a round table, everyone present turned around and looked at her. Korean school, Emperor Dok Ko Hong, sat in his chair and, placing one hand on the table, silently looked at his daughter. Seeing what was lying on the table in front of her father, she trembled and stared at him in horror. In front of him on the table lay on a napkin the weapon of the commander of the cavalry detachment, Kong Kushim. From shock, the deputy head of Chanshan was dumbfounded and, looking at the chains, could not utter a word. But realizing what the head of the Korean school wanted to say in the silent silence, she screamed furiously. The moon hung over the entire Gansu province. It was a quiet and peaceful night in the Iron Banner League. The commander of the heavenly detachment was only able to reach the gates of his league by midnight. The guards who stood guarding the gate blocked his path with spears. Makhun asked them to convey that the captain of the heavenly detachment from the Black Banner Party had arrived. Exhaling, the guards lowered their spears and said that he could pass because they knew him. When Commander Makhun entered the territory of the Iron Banner, he heard rumors about Dedu from all sides. All the warriors, without noticing him, said that some captain of a detachment of jesters had defeated one of the masters of the Korean school. Makhun was shocked when he heard this news. He didn't understand how Dedu was able to win and what martial arts he used. Some warrior running up to his comrade said that Dedu killed Kong Kushim with his own silver chain. Everyone around was discussing this incredible event and admired the captain of the jester squad. Nobody paid attention to Makhun, who had just arrived. Stung by the fact that everyone was ignoring him, he walked past the elder's house with his head down. But then voices were heard from the house and Makhun, clenching his teeth, looked in his direction. There was a squad of jesters in the house. Banhyo talked to Ma Mangek and the elder, bandaging De's wounded hands, asked him what he would do if he was promoted to deputy leader for this victory. Leaning back in his chair, De, closing his eyes, said that it was just a fight for survival and that he would refuse this position. Cutting off the bandage, the elder said that he was grateful that he survived and that this was enough for him because he was a low-class warrior. De, checking the bandages on his wounds, said that it was enough for him that he survived. The commander of the heavenly detachment entered the house. There was a table in the middle of the room. Tea and some food are stored on it. And on the fireplace in the professional room there was a vase and several signs. Commander Makhun walked into this room and fell exhausted onto a wooden bench. But as soon as he sat down, someone called out to him and he suddenly raised his head. One warrior entered the house and, placing one hand on his hip, said that Makhun was being summoned by the deputy head. The two of them entered the Iron Banner League palace and walked through long corridors. The commander of the heavenly detachment was worried before the meeting with the deputy head and said that he had better wash and change clothes in front of her. But the warrior who led him did not answer him. They entered the meeting room where the deputy head of Sapyong and the head of the Iron Banner League himself were sitting at the table. The captain of the heavenly squad, Makhun, bowed and folded his hands in a greeting position and reported that he had arrived at the league and was glad to meet the head and his deputy. Answer anything, but only knitted his eyebrows and looked at him furiously. He asked the warrior who brought Makhun if this was the captain of the heavenly detachment. The warrior looked sideways at Makhun who, smiling, continued to hold one fist near his palm and said that it was him. The head asked his deputy why Captain Makhun returned back with such courage, to which the deputy head replied that he had no idea that his true face had been revealed. The head replied that this was disgusting. He was very furious, but without taking his eyes off he continued to look at the captain of the heavenly detachment. Makhun, not knowing what was happening, began to report that at the height of the battle on a cliff, he was buried under a mountain of corpses and barely got out. The deputy chief said they would hold a meeting in the afternoon after they got Makhun to confess. To which the warrior replied that he understood the order and put his fist to his palm. Then he grabbed Makhun by the shoulder, who was already taking a step towards the head, asking what they meant by the word confess. But then the warrior sharply grabbed the captain of the heavenly detachment by the throat, so that he began to choke. For a second the warrior held Makhun by the throat, who was trembling and already turning red from lack of oxygen. A moment later, he grabbed the commander of the heavenly squad by the collar and dragged him away from the meeting hall. The head looked sternly at his deputy and told him not to connect the internal investigation about the spy with the result of the meeting held recently, to which the deputy head nodded in agreement with him. He smiled affably while the head said that this failed plan helped remove the head of the party. The head of the Iron Banner was furious that the rat was still annoyingly running under his feet. Having closed the topic with the rat, the head asked how the investigation into the D was progressing, to which the deputy head replied that he would bring him a report within the day. The head released Sopyung so that he could prepare for the report, and he began to leave the meeting room. When he left, he carefully closed the doors behind him with one hand. He smiled gloomily and thought that the deputy head was not so stupid as to believe that Makhun was a spy. A huge corridor, and thought that he needed to collect all the information about the captain of the squad of Jokers Dae-do. And so the deputy head began to collect information about him. The first warrior whom he asked Chukai the back of his head said that he fought with him at one time, but even though Dae-do did not master martial arts, he fought well. As he remembered, Dae-do, when he was still a 16-year-old teenager, killed several worthy warriors of the Union of Six Schools with his knife. Deputy head said that it was surprising that Dae-do had not yet been killed, considering that he uses a fighting technique that no one understands. He is always collected and constantly walks around with his strangely shaped nameless sword. The third warrior said that Dae-do always achieved something wherever he went and, throwing up his hands, said that it was strange that Dae-do had never held a high position. He said that Dae-do always looked like a rebel, and that's probably why the commanders never liked him. The fourth warrior, crossing his fingers and sitting on a chair, said that Dae-do somehow killed 3 people among the elders. He was annoyed that Dae-do's fighting skills were poor, and yet somehow he killed opponents who were much stronger than him. The warrior said that once all his guys gathered to grab only him, but Dae-do fought like a ghost. The warrior clenched his teeth with rage and said that even though now they are allies, but someday he will meet him as an enemy and kill him with his own hands. The deputy head asked Han Sung about Dae-do, and he smiled and said that he recommended him. When the deputy head asked Han Sung to tell him something about Dae-do, Mrs. Hobi Up passed by. She became interested in this issue and decided to listen to what Han Sung had to say. But he put his hand behind his head, said that he knew little about Dae-do, and plunged into his memories of that day when they first met. The weather was good and Han Sung was accompanying a group of merchants. They walked along a road in the forest. There were 2 horse-drawn carts and a large group of traders. As they walked along this road, several merchants called out to Han Sung. He turned to them and wanted to understand why these people called him. He listened as one of the merchants said that there was a bandit's lair ahead and he was sure that there would be an ambush on their way. Han Sung smiled triumphantly and told them not to worry because they were protected by the flag of the Iron Banner League. Han Sung looked at the red flag that was fluttering in the wind and told the merchants that no robber would attack them at the sight of this flag. Smiling joyfully, one of the merchants argued that if they are protected by the League and if they lose something, then it will reimburse them for everything. After these words, the second merchant hit him in the side with his elbow. A moment later, Han Sung looked forward and, noticing something, became wary. His face became concentrated. He raised his sword and ordered everyone to stop. And after his order, all the merchants began to worry. The horse cart stopped immediately. They saw that the defeated bandits were lying on their way. When the warriors accompanying the group decided to approach the bodies lying on the ground, the merchants followed them to look at them. One of the warriors, pointing his finger at some person, said that there was a survivor here, and Han Song turned around to look at him. When he came closer, he saw a man who was all beaten up. He sat on the ground, leaning his back against a stone and breathing heavily. Han Song cautiously walked closer to him and said that he was from the Iron Banner and wanted to know what happened here. One of the League warriors stood near Dae-do. When Dae-do rose from the earth, he spat out blood and said that these robbers were to blame. Surprised that there were only corpses of bandits here, Han Song asked who did this to them. Dae-do said that he was just walking by, but the robbers blocked his way, saying that they did not like his look. Han Song asked in surprise if he killed them all, to which Dae-do, barely able to stand on his feet, objected that he only killed one and then all the rest of them attacked him. After that, they put him on the cart to rest and Han Song looked after him all the time. When Han Sun returned from his memories, seeing a worried smile, the deputy head added that when they cured all Dae-do's wounds, he wanted to repay them, so Han Sun invited him to come to the League and help. After this story, Mrs. Hobi Up asked the deputy head who was holding the notebook in his hands who the story was about. The deputy head exhaled heavily and said that this story was about the captain of the jester detachment. And looking at his notebook, he added that having gotten to know him more, he doubts that such a person could kill Kong Kushim. Throwing up her hands, Mrs. Hobi Up suggested that he might just be lucky. The deputy head put his finger to his chin and thought for a second. The lady continued to claim that although Dae-do had lost a lot, he actually managed to defeat the master of the Korean school in this battle. The deputy head of the evil one smiled and said that Dae-do did it, although he himself did not know how much luck he still had left. And presenting a big bag of money, the deputy head thought that now Dae-do should generously pay for his luck. A bag of money stood on a wooden table. It contained 10 silver coins. A squad of jesters sat at the table. The elder and Bangya watched as their captain examined the coins of Alma. Mangek claimed that 10 silver coins were not enough for the fact that Dae-do destroyed one of the 9 masters of the Korean school. And smiling he added that he is very glad that Dae-do continues to be their captain. Banhyo, pointing his finger at the captain, said that he was already lucky that he was not killed, even though he was responsible for the attack plan that failed. Ma Bangek objected to him and said that the plan failed because there was an information leak, and he did not understand why the Black Banner Party should bear responsibility for this. But then he was surprised that a bag of coins flew to him. Throwing the bag to Ma Bangek's captain told him to go and buy the whole party booze and meat. He told Banhyo to come with him and make sure that this money was not stolen. Banhyo approached Ma Bangek, who was already holding the bag of coins in his hands, put his hand on his shoulder and said that it was time for them to move out. It was a clear day. The sun peeking out from behind the clouds illuminated the house where the detachment of jesters was located. There were tools on the table. The sharpening scissors and hooks were in a small bowl of water. The elder unrolled the leather roll and washed his tools. Meanwhile, Captain Dae was sharpening his sword. The elder saw how Dae sharpens his sword and was very surprised and asked the captain if his assumption was correct that when Dae makes these movements, he also sharpens his mind. The captain didn't answer him, and when he finished sharpening his sword, he pulled it out in front of him and began to look at it. Seeing that the sword was not sharp enough, Dae-do continued to sharpen it, and the elder, washing his tools, said that he was worried about the party commander and No Jongdo because they were not in the best shape. At this very moment the meeting of commanders was in full swing. The head, his deputy, Anso, No Jongdo and Mrs. Hobi Up were sitting at a large table. The lady could not believe that the spy from the Korean school was Captain Makhun of the Heavenly Squad. Deputy head Sopyoung smiled and said that this was really so because this criminal Makhun confessed to everything. Mrs. Hobi Up looked at the deputy head in disbelief and said that Makhun tried the best in achieving the goals set by the League. To which Sopyoung objected to her that most likely he was trying to rise to a high position in their organization in order to get the information he needed. And throwing up his hands, he continued to assert that he didn't even want to imagine what could have happened if they appreciated his merits and he was now sitting with them at this table. But the lady crossed her arms on her chest and didn't answer him. A shop town illuminated by the rays of the afternoon sun in Gansu province, which is located near the Iron Banner League. Ma Bangek watched in confusion as Banhyo entered one of the shops from the threshold and told the owner that they needed booze and better quality meat. Looking at the confident Banhyo, the recruit suggested not to take too expensive one because they need to buy it for all team members. To which Banhyo objected to him and said that there were only 50 people left in the party, among whom 20 were bedridden and could only eat porridge. Ma Bangek understood what he meant his comrade and hit his palm with his fist. While Bangyo and Ma Bangek shopping, the meeting of commanders continued. The leader said that the operation on Mount Noho failed because of a spy and they would not bring the Black Banner Party to justice. He looked gloomily at all the commanders and said that there would be no more reinforcements in the Black Banner Party. All the commanders looked at the head and were shocked by what they heard, and Commander No Kondo expressed his dissatisfaction. Hitting the table with his good hand, he said that there were 13 people left in the party who were capable of fighting, in addition to those who were seriously wounded. The deputy head calmly suggested that they could disband the Black Banner Party and distribute all remaining participants to other parties. The captain of the prankster squad was lying on the bed and his sword was hanging above him on the wall. The elder sat at the table leafing through a book and said that since the commander did not return, the meeting was delayed. Placing both hands behind his head, Day-Do said that it is not surprising because the big plan failed due to the infiltration of a spy. Not understanding why his captain was so calm, the elder asked why he wasn't angry. Continuing to lie and look at the ceiling, Day-Do claimed that he was not simple-minded to be angry about this, but on the contrary, he considered it strange if there was no conspiracy. The elder asked worriedly that the captain would really just leave it that way, to which Day-Do dispassionately replied that it was none of his business. The commander's conscience, the elder compared the current situation to a shipwreck, saying that when a ship sinks, the passengers drown with it and that the problem will soon affect their squad. Staring at the ceiling, the D.O. indifferently replied that if the ship is sinking, then let it definitely not be his. One of the main halls of the Iron Banner League. There was an altar under the main flag of the league. In front of the vase into which the lit sticks were stuck lay a large spear. Lady Hobi Up was sitting in front of the altar. She folded her hands on her knees, lowered her head and prayed with her eyes closed. The spear had a very interesting shape. In addition to the main blade in the middle, there were two more curved blades on the sides. Lady Hobi Up took it. She held it with one hand and held the spear in front of her. She placed the palm of her second hand vertically in front of her and closed her eyes to concentrate. And a moment later she began to practice with him. Lunging to the side, she took the spear with both hands and thrust into the air. Then she jumped up, twirling the spear in one hand and finishing the combination with a downward slash. Then the lady jumped back, swung her spear and threw it high into the air. A moment later, she jumped up and grabbed a spear in the air with great power and cut the air. But the next second she released the spear from her hands and it fell heavily to the floor. Hobi Up also fell to the floor. Exhausted, she lay in the middle of the large hall. The lady lay on the floor, breathing heavily and with tears in her eyes. She mentally addressed her deceased father and brother and told them that the Iron Banner League was in danger. She, lying on the floor for a long time, looked at the altar above which hung a flag with the inscription Steadfastness and remembered her father and older brother. She sat down and began to tell her father, after whose death 10 years had passed, that she had renounced her happiness in order to spend all her strength on preserving the Iron Banner League. Looking at the iron spear, she thought that it had become too heavy for her. She gathered all her strength, took it in her hands and, leaning on it, began to rise. With tears in her eyes, she looked at the altar and, calling for the help of the dead, said that the League was losing the battle from Kurian school. Putting the spear in its place, she asked her father to give her the strength to preserve his Iron Banner League. Continuing to stand near the altar, she prayed that he would give her strength to also protect her younger brother. When Mrs. Hobi Up she turned to her father, she did not know that her younger brother was watching her. He was having lunch at the moment when he noticed his sister come to the altar. He anxiously watched her from above, holding a cup of sake in his hands and could not take his eyes off her. Meanwhile, happy with their purchases, Banhyo and Ma the Bangek were returning to the Iron Banner League. Ma Bangek, carrying a whole huge pig behind him, said that this would not be enough for 30 people. But what about Banhyo, who was carrying 4 huge jugs of booze, replied that this would be enough. Approaching the gate of Mangek, seeing something terrible, he stopped abruptly and fright and cold sweat ran all over his body. Concerned about this behavior of your comrade Banhyo, ask him what he saw, and Mangek pointed forward with his finger. Makhun was tied by the hair on a long spear, and a sign was hung with the inscription that a traitor was hanging here. In the room, Commander Anso and En about Kondo were sitting at the table, who said that even a dog would laugh at the fact that Makhun could be a spy. Closing his eyes and folding his hands on his chest, Anso, without answering anything, plunged into thought. But Jongdo, realizing that the organization had simply found a scapegoat in the person of the commander of the Heavenly Squad, he hit his fist on the table and was angry that he and the League could not find the real spy. Seemingly calm, Anso was hit by En. Jongdo opened his eyes, looked at him and said that Makhun really couldn't be a rat. But then some kind of bustle coming from the street distracted him and he looked questioningly out the window. The two commanders immediately went outside to see what was happening there. Anso, who had previously seemed calm and cool-headed, froze in place and stared forward in shock. All the warriors of the Black Banner Party gathered in the courtyard to have a good rest after a difficult battle. Someone brought firewood, the elder fanned the fire on which the pork was fried, and Mangek did not cut the bread skillfully. The warriors lined up, chatting happily with each other, and Banhyo poured drinks into their bowls with a small ladle. Most of the warriors lined up around a makeshift stadium where two teams were playing football and shouted where to pass the ball. Mrs. Hobi Up, not understanding why all the soldiers had gathered in the courtyard and were shouting, approached the crowd to see what was happening there. Opening her mouth in surprise at what she saw, she froze in place, amazed at how the men were kicking the ball around the field and encouraging each other. She saw how the captain of the Jester squad, taking the ball on his chest, with his arms out to the sides, jumped high into the air. Then he swung his leg and hit the ball with incredible force that the ball flew at such a speed that it was not even visible. In a second the ball was at the opponent's goal, hit the crossbar with enormous power and bounced to the side. And everyone present began to admire this blow. When the ball was in play again, everyone tried to take it from the enemy and attacked each other just to get it. But the ball again ended up in the hands of Day, who skillfully knew how to play football, and the opponents could not take the ball from him. Mrs. Hobi Up looked at everything that was happening with bewilderment and did not understand how they could play and have fun if they were injured. The elder said that it is good to be young, continuing to sit on the stone and waving his fan over the fire where the meat was roasting. The lady said with concern that if they were so active, their wounds would open, and the elder objected that they would not open. Moreover, such stubborn young people, and having said this, he put a log on the fire. Commander Anso and No Kondo stood and watched this entire gathering. They were pleased that all the warriors were in good spirits and having fun after such a difficult battle on Mount Noho. The match was in full swing and the ball ended up in the hands of a warrior who had once fought with Day-do in the past. He quickly ran forward. He did not lose possession of the ball even when his opponents made a tackle and tried to take him away. He abruptly went to the side and, making his trump maneuver, dodged the enemy and then at great speed rushed straight to the goal. Day, who was on the other team, watched his opponent and thought that he had once seen the same movements as his, but could not remember where exactly. Three warriors who were in midfield flew straight at their opponent with the goal of taking the ball away from him. Seeing that the enemy was running towards him and wanted to take the ball away, the warrior with one movement of his leg pushed the ball back and threw it up. Then he himself found himself in the air while the enemy was trying to reach him on earth. Dissatisfied with not being able to pick up the ball, the muscular warrior stopped and watched his opponent pull off his trick. The warrior with white hair turned over in the air. Then he landed on his hands and caught the ball with both feet. For a moment he stood in a handstand like an outstretched string. Then he pulled his knees to his chest and braced himself for another jump. Noticing this, the muscular warrior who was a rival from the other team became angry that he was outplayed. He didn't want his team to lose and furiously tried to catch up with the blonde guy with the ball. Team crashed into him at great speed to prevent him from taking the ball. The warrior was thrown back somersault and after he had flown a few meters, he fell face down. And a player from the other team stood like a stone and put his fists forward to protect his comrade and give him the opportunity to score a goal. The warrior in white uniform quickly ran forward, dodging his opponents and without losing possession of the ball. When he ran up to the goal, one of the best players stood in his way. Dae-do, with a smug smile, preparing to take the ball, teasingly asked his opponent if he could get past him. Do for a very long time directed his furious gaze at him. Then he swung his leg and hit the ball with incredible force, and the ball flew straight at the captain of the jester squad. Realizing that at such a speed Dae-do would not be able to hit the ball and, dissatisfied with this, he simply dodged it. But at that same moment, the warrior who hated Dae-do began to carry out a very fast series of kicks. And Dae-do, barely dodging them, thought that his opponent's technique was impressive. But at that same second, the warrior dealt Dae-do such a blow that he could not dodge and only managed to regroup. The impact knocked him back. He put one leg back and placed a block with his hands, slid along the ground and tried to stop. When he managed to do this, he carefully looked at his opponent and remembered where he could see the same movements and said that he was from the Bishong school. The blonde warrior, pushing off the ground and flying with his fists straight at Dae-do, shouted at him that he was silent. And now they are both ready to collide in a fight and rush towards each other. Banhyo, noticing that they were going to fight, he dropped the ladle with booze and ran towards them, and Mangek, while laying out the bread, looked around in surprise. Banhyo, with a joyful smile and the thought that he would now fight, already ran up to the warrior with white hair in anticipation of the fight. Noticing this, the warrior prepared to dodge his attacks, and when Banhyo made his first blow, he dodged him. But Banhyo did not give up and continued to strike a series of numerous blows, and his opponent easily evaded them without even trying to strike back. The three commanders stood aside and watched their warriors. Mrs. Hobi Up was worried about the men, and so that they would not hurt themselves even more, she suggested to Anso that they dissuade them from fighting each other. But he did not answer her. Banhyo was exhausted from carrying out blows that did not reach the target and breathing heavily. He told his opponent that he was moving very well. Approaching the warrior, Dae-do put one hand on his belt and asked him if they had met before in battle. Turning to him, the warrior took a fighting position and said that he was no longer a student of the Bishong school and that today he would avenge the death of his uncle. Looking at his opponent, Dae-do put his second hand on his belt and calmly said that he was ready to fight him only once. To which the warrior said that it was time for them to stop chatting and was the first to strike with his foot, which Dae-do easily dodged by jumping back. But unexpectedly, another opponent decided to attack him from behind, but Dae-do noticed this during the time and was able to dodge this blow. The new opponent, after his attack, stood in a fighting position and said that he was a fifth-generation student of the Bishong school, that he had the image of the wind and his name was Hwa-un. Hwa-un and his captain surrounded Dae-do on both sides, ready to continue the battle right this second. Dae-do sighed and said that he was just a mercenary and did not want to participate in fights for which he was not paid. To which the warrior who hates Dae-do so much said with hatred that if he doesn't want to fight, then let him die calmly by his hand. Dae-do, putting his hand to his head wound, said that he did not want to fight with any of them. Looking his opponent in the eye, he added that if he fights seriously, he will quickly deal with the enemy. At that very second Mangek and Bangyo stood in front of their captain to protect him. Banhyo smiling, he said that it would be a shame if he just left the scene of the fight. And a moment later, two warriors from the jester squad rushed at their rivals, wanting to defeat them. Banhyo chose Hwa as his opponent Una and, anticipating a good battle, decided to strike him first. He hit Hwa-una heads to the body with monstrous force, thinking that this blow will knock out her opponent. But when the blow was made, his opponent did not even move, and Banhyo thought that this was very strange. Next moment Hwa-un, who was twice as big and stronger, clamped Banhyo in a vice. Tighter every second, and Banhyo could not escape from his strong embrace. The longer Banhyo continued to remain in his grip, the more difficult it became for him to breathe. Bangyo lay lifeless on the ground while Hwa-un stood and looked at his defeated opponent. But then he heard someone running and wanting to attack him from behind. He turned to face his next opponent. Mangek made a jump and, putting his hands forward, was ready to strike the first blow to his opponent. He hit Hwa as hard as he could Una to the side, but he didn't move from his place, just looked at him. Hwa-un did not strike back. He just tensed his body, and from this Mangek was pushed back. Looking straight at his opponent, he was disappointed and at the same time angry that because of Hwa's thick skin Una he can't hit his vital organs. But he did not give up and tried to carry out strikes and use different techniques over and over again. Wan did not dodge Ma's blows. Bangoka simply stood rooted to the spot, covering his face with his hands and saying that he did not want to fight with him. Ma Bangek told him that if he is Captain De's enemy, then he is his enemy too, and continued to deliver a series of blows. Wan, still not dodging his attacks and covering his head with his hands, said plaintively that he does not hit girls. Angry at being called Ma's girl, Bangek started shouting that he was a guy and, upset, he stopped fighting seriously and continued kicking him like a child. And at this time, the trio of commanders, standing on the sidelines, watched as their charges fought among themselves. Mrs. Hobi Up was a little perplexed and exhaled and said that they had some strength left since they started a fight. Addressing Anso and No, Jongdo claimed that if anyone saw what was happening here, they would certainly think that they had won a victory over the Korean school. Anso, without taking his eyes off the fighters, said that he may lose in battle, but his soul will not die. Mrs. Hobi Up looked at him with an uncomprehending look. Anso continued his short speech and added that if the soul perishes, so does the strength of spirit. And if there is no strength of spirit, then there is no victory. Mrs. Hobi Up turned to the elder, who was still preparing the meat, and asked where the money for this whole celebration came from. The elder, raising the next board, proudly said that everyone was treated to the captain of the jester squad, the D.O. Mrs. Hobi Up was shocked that the captain of the jester squad spent his entire bonus on this. At this time, Dae-do and his opponent continued their fight. The warrior who wanted to take revenge on Dae-do continued to attack him and kicked him, and Dae-do, in turn, skillfully dodged them. Anso noticed that Mrs. Hobi Up turned around and walked away from the commanders in the direction of the gong. She took the mace that was lying nearby, swung it and furiously hit the gong with all her strength and ordered everyone to stop. Instantly everyone present froze in place and the fighting stopped. The warriors fell silent and turned to Mrs. Hobi Up, discouraged. Everyone looked at her and waited for what she would say. And the lady, standing with a mace in her hands near the gong, argued that according to the laws of the Iron Banner League, they are now not allowed to have fun. Dae-do was surprised that this woman whom he did not know was ordering them what to do. Ma Bangek whispered to his captain that this woman was the younger sister of their leader. The elder, checking the meat for readiness, listened as Mrs. Hobi Up continued to say that they should not organize such holidays without permission if they do not want the authorities to find out about it. Was silent for a second to maintain the intrigue and then smiled insidiously. A moment later, she, pleased with herself, told everyone gathered that since she had already reproached them for this feast, they could continue to have fun further. All the soldiers were very happy about this. The only one who was dissatisfied was the warrior who hated the D.O. because he again could not take revenge on him. Ma Bangek went up to his comrade and tried to wake him up so that he would get up, but Bangyo did not get up and only whispered that his chest hurt. The warriors began to gather in groups and make more fires, and Mrs. Hobi Up approached Anso and offered him a little drink. The fun was really in full swing. Sitting near the fires, some warriors talked to each other and drank, while others stood in line for meat. The commanders also started eating. The three of them sat on the rug and drank sake, and Mrs. Hobi Up helped No Jong-do and put meat on his plate. Ma Bangek stood at the distribution and said that if someone lacks something, please don't be shy and come up for more. But then a huge and formidable Wa appeared in front of him with whom they did not end their battle. He smiled sweetly and, scratching the back of his head, asked to pour him some meat. Ma Bangek glared at him and was still angry that Wa-un called him a girl. He took out the pig's head and gave it to Wa-yun, said that she is just like him. He was very happy that he got his entire head. Away from everyone, completely alone, a warrior with white hair and a dissatisfied face sat and drank sake. D.O. sat down with him with his bowl. The warrior clearly did not want to be in his company and glared at him. After some time, Banhyo noticed that his commander was sitting in the company of his opponents and having a friendly drink with them. Unable to bear such an unpleasant company, the warrior looked furiously at Dae-do and thought what kind of person he was that he would join his enemies. While pouring sake for his opponent and himself, Dae-do calmly said that the Bijong school was one of the strongest schools. He said that when he was hired to fight in Shijiazhuan County, then in an instant he was confused and it seemed to him that he could not escape death. And Dae-do was plunged into his memories when he was attacked by a whole crowd of experienced warriors and he alone, trying to avoid death, fought with them to his limit. Returning to reality, he asked his opponent if he would stop being hostile towards him if he apologized for killing his uncle and 4 brothers. Of his hand, threw aside the bowl into which to do only that he poured the drink. The warrior looked at him furiously and said that his hatred for him would not disappear because of a couple of words spoken. Everyone paid attention to them. Banhyo rushed off and wanted to teach him a lesson, but the elder held him by the hand. Everyone was at a loss as to what was going on. Even Mrs. Hobi Up and Anso did not understand why they were in conflict. Slowly getting up from his seat, Dae-do told his opponent that he was giving him a chance to take revenge. Standing up to his full height and pointing to the 2 warriors with whom Dae-do fought today, he said out loud that today they are members of the squad of jokers. These words of his shocked everyone, especially the entire squad of jokers, and Banhyo, as usual, wanted to intervene. Discouraged by these statements, Wan sat and did not understand anything, while his comrade exploded and said that no one could arbitrarily change their affiliation with any detachment. Dae-do, who is mostly indifferent to the rules, smugly and defiantly said that he could do it. Then, with complete seriousness, he said that he would have a better chance of killing him if they were in the same squad. Anso, drinking sake, watched what was happening and waited with interest to see how their argument would end. The warrior, furious at such a statement, shouted that he had the right to refuse and not join his detachment. Dae-do calmly said that he had the right to refuse and there was no need to talk about this to a low-class martial arts master, which irritated his interlocutor even more. Then Dae-do sat back on the ground cross-legged and said he didn't want to fight with him. Dae-do drank his sake and asked his opponent how he knew that it was he who killed his family in the past. The warrior became even more angry with the captain of the jester squad and increasingly wanted to take revenge on Dae-do by killing him. But Dae-do continued to dispassionately say that then not a single person was left alive and that sometimes the weaker one can win. Listening to all this and not saying a word, Commander Anso continued to drink his drink. Dae-do poured another cup of sake and offered it to the warrior and told him to postpone his revenge until later. The warrior was overcome by many internal contradictions. He didn't want to do this because he had been putting off his revenge for a long time. He reluctantly sat down in front of the cup in which Dae-do had poured him a drink, quickly drank every last drop in one motion and put it back on the ground. He stretched out his hand and furiously told Dae-do to wait for the sword in the back, to which the captain of the jester squad, smiling contentedly, said that it would be very interesting.